Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a new episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. The 10 Things Every Jew Should Know Before They Go to College. Catchy, right? Well, that's the title of a new book by Blake Flayton and Emily Schrader, two prominent Israel defenders on social media and around the world. This book provides an overview of Jewish culture and the subjects pertaining to the Middle East commonly brought up at college campuses today. It was written by Blake and Emily to help Jewish students prepare for the challenges they'll face on campus. As its authors write, in addition to arming students with the information they need to counter anti-Semitic lies, 10 Things Every Jew Should Know also seeks to encourage students to reassert their Jewish values, ideas, and ideals that have constituted Jewish life and culture for millennia. On today's episode, I speak with Blake, whose personal journey from, as he explains, being a progressive Reform Jew from Arizona to Israel advocate began during his time at GW. He spent the last few years living in Israel, writing, podcasting, and speaking on behalf of the country. Blake shares the story of his own evolution, why this year's campuses seem a bit milder than last year, and also what has pushed him to take his latest decision to draft into the IDF this coming spring. Have a listen. Blake, it's great to have you with us on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, there's a lot to talk about, and we'll go in a couple of different directions here, but I want to start with, you've been doing a lot of work on the Hasbara front over the last year, definitely over the last 14 months since October 7th, in I would say a higher gear, but this has really been a lot of what you've done for the last few years, ever since you've kind of entered into this Israel space and of course moved here. But I want to look at now 14 months into this war and just get your sense of where things stand, because we saw obviously very heightened college campuses, anti-Semitism, tent encampments last year. Is it just me, or are things a bit more mellow this semester that just started, 2 months ago or so?
Well, I think you're right. And I think the reason why there might be a feeling that things are a little bit more mellow sort of explains the problem very well, as well. And the problem is what we're seeing on college campuses, in regards to anti-Israel activism. I don't even like to call it that. I like to call it like pro-Hamas, pro-Hezbollah activism. What we're seeing is a social contagion, right? These protests grow in size, they grow in number. The BDS list grows in supporters. The BDS resolution, I should say, rather, in the student government grows in supporters. And the anti-Israel lies on social media grow in popularity because of numbers, because of people sharing it with each other, because of the social aspect of this. And that's why the encampment problem really swelled to a point where many, including myself, believed it had gotten quite out of hand. It's because of the social element, this, very Gen Z, but of course not specific to Gen Z, but very modern development where you can create a political movement and have it grow to be something very radical and even very destructive very quickly. And you see that with young people just, by way of cell phones and by the way of the internet and social media and the way that we communicate, and also the layer of peer pressure that goes along with that, and the feeling of, well, I need to do this because this is what my friends are doing and this is the right thing to do. That, of course, is also influenced by, activism. Really saw Floyd. That was sort of the moment when social media really became a platform to people to start expressing political views and to become recognized for them. So I think, yes, it's milder right now, it's mellower, but that sort of explains the problem. It's not it's not on the front page like it was last semester.
So I get your answer about why things have kind of mellowed a bit, or maybe a bit milder. And we have to hope, by the way, just for the sake of the Jewish students on campuses, that it does stay that way, because we did see the definite suffering and pain that a lot of Jewish students had been through. Your own personal story, Blake, also kind of has some beginnings of its own on a college campus. You want to just walk us through like what happened to you that brought you into this journey of working to defend Israel around the world and especially on social media?
Yeah, so I always like to start off that answer by saying that if someone had told me 5 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that, 6 years ago, that I would be living in Israel, working as sort of a full-time, as you said, defender of Israel, defender of the Jewish people, but also very much involved in like the Jewish Israeli political space, I would have said, you are crazy. You are crazy to suggest that I would have a book coming out very soon about anti-Semitism. Because when I was a kid and growing up into college, um, my biggest passion was like local and national progressive politics, left-wing politics. That's what I wanted to do for a career. That's why I went to GW. That's why I worked on Capitol Hill for my congressman. That's why I worked on different local and statewide and presidential campaigns and was involved in all of these different organizations on my campus, pushing for things like a $15 minimum wage, legalization of marijuana, racial justice, LGBT justice, you name it, reproductive health, of course. Um, and when I got to campus, well, I didn't really have like a wide knowledge of Jewish issues. I had never been to Israel before. I had been bar mitzvahed, and my family went to, synagogue twice a year, but that pretty much it. I did go to a very Jewish Israeli heavy on campus that really made me uncomfortable. Things like, and I can go into examples, there was an LGBT pride march in DC. And the organizers of this march made a point to ban the Megan David pride flag. So if there was a rainbow flag with a Megan David on it, they said you couldn't come to the march because this was a quote unquote nationalist symbol. Of course, they didn't make a point to, ban any other nationalist symbols, but that one was banned. And when we showed up to the march, the organizers of the rally, who were Jewish, by the way, actually made a point to like create a physical barrier to prevent us from marching in this parade. There was an incident on my campus where this girl was being filmed coming home from a party, and the guy behind the camera says, "What are we going to do to Israel?" And she turns around and says, "We're going to bomb Israel, you Jewish pieces of shit." There was a May Day rally, in support of janitors at the school getting paid $15 an hour. And for some reason, when SJP was invited to speak, it turned into a rally against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. So I can go on and on and on. There's a lot more that I could list. But basically, in summary, I found myself very uncomfortable in these spaces because of the rhetoric and because of the behavior surrounding Zionism and Jews and anti-Semitism. And again, this was before I could even consider myself a Zionist, in that regard. I considered myself a comrade. And so it led to a lot of social isolation and feelings of vulnerability when I did speak out about these issues. And at one point, it just got to be too much. And I wrote an article about my experience, and I was lucky enough to get it published in the New York Times. And basically, from there, I continued my writing career, and then I started speaking out on social media sometime after that.
I mean, it's almost like as if you depict something of like a betrayal because you had dedicated your own life to these progressive causes, but then these
Absolutely.
comrades, as you called them, were betraying you and not standing on your side when you were coming under attack, or were marginalizing or maligning you for being Jewish or even having anything that's pro Israel. What is it about the progressive? Because there's a lot of talk, and everything's going to change. Maybe now that Trump is coming into office, there's wokeism is dead. I hear people say all the time. I'm not even getting into that, but I'm just asking a simpler question. What is it so much about the progressive circle or or progressive community that generates this fierce hatred of all things Israel? In some of those, obviously not everyone, but in some parts of that community.
Well, there's a sort of a long-winded answer, but I'll do my best to be concise because it is important. Uh, right now, the young generation, and not the entire young generation, but the young educated generation, is receiving a very specific type of education. And I'm talking about, courses and the environment, the academic environment at universities. The more prestigious the university, perhaps the worse and more severe this climate is. And this climate says that there are particular evils in the world. There are the evils of white supremacy. There are the evils of genocide. There are the evils of racism, homophobia, sexism, ableism, any ism in the negative sense that you can think of, but in a very left-wing sense of, in a very left-wing worldview. Now, it just so happens that every time a society turns to this very dogmatic thinking, as in there exists an evil out there that stands in the way between us and a better world. There is this evil out there that has infected all of our institutions, and it's very vague. It's hard to characterize. It's hard to attach details to. So, like, white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, colonialism, all of these in the 21st century are very vague concepts. Like, yes, they're a problem. Yes, they have consequences that are not ideal in areas that we can pinpoint, but mostly they take the form of like a boogeyman, as something like obstructing and preventing us from reaching a better world. And time again, every time a society takes on this dogmatic sort of conspiratorial thinking, the Jews find their way into taking the shape of that evil, that thing. It's why in 1984, the book by George Orwell, all of the party members gather, I think, once a week to scream and rage at a figure of a Jewish man, Goldstein, called the 2 Minutes of Hate. George Orwell was very clear to make George Orwell's face, to make Goldstein a Jewish man with a Jewish face, whatever that means. Um, and so that's exactly what's happening here. Israel has assumed the role of the Jews throughout the centuries in taking the shape of that which a given society finds the most repugnant, finds the most repellent, and which it can attach to all of the things that it wants to defeat, all of the things that they feel are holding them back. And that is what is happening with Israel on the college campus. Um, very, very clearly. It's fascinating to watch because, you have these organizations, these student organizations who don't have anything to do with each other, really, at face value. You have one organization that advocates for reproductive rights. You have another organization that advocates for racial justice and another for $15 minimum wage. And the anti-Israel activists have taken a playbook out of the anti-Semitic history so precisely because they have discovered that what can we do? What can we use? What can we use to employ in order to unite all of these factions, in order to get everyone on campus angry about the same things, wanting the same things,
Israel.
Israel, or more specifically, the Jews, the Jewish students, right? That is their unifying factor. That is their coalition builder, as anti-Semitism has been throughout the centuries. That's how you get all of these organizations to come together under one banner.
So I guess part of the output or the experience is what led you to write together with Emily Schrader, a mutual friend, a new book that's coming out just in a few weeks, 10 Things Every Jew Should Know Before Going to College, right? And
Yes.
this is, so tell us, and maybe I'm just going out, I haven't seen the book, haven't read it yet. Nice cover. Looks like it, it looks good, but I'm guessing this is meant to arm the Jewish students with the knowledge that they require to be able to push back against this.
Yeah, basically, Emily and I have approached this book with the belief that the Jewish community has underestimated uh, how much knowledge they can give their young people. There's been a really big emphasis lately, and as far as I've been in sort of the Hasbara space of, you know, presenting things to people in very simple terms in the form of talking points. And I don't think that that strategy has been effective. And so what this book does in an enjoyable way, in a pithy and easy to read way, of course, doesn't underestimate the Jewish young people in the West and gives them all of the information and all of the resources that they should know and that they are capable of knowing and using in order to defend Israel and the Jewish people on campus. And that includes things like, the inner politics of UNRWA, the inner politics of the occupation, what exactly was in the Oslo peace process, what exactly is going on today in Israel in regards to the UN and UNIFIL and Lebanon and Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic and the Abraham Accords, the intricacies of these details that are crucial to strengthening a Zionist argument that we feel has been incredibly lacking in replace of, funny TikToks and easy to remember talking points that don't really do a good job of defending us.
I mean, it's almost as if I've often felt, often in conversations with head of Jewish organizations or Jewish federations, is that we're so focused on, how do we change the mood on college campuses? How do we get the media to be better? Obviously, all important things. But one thing that I think, as a Jewish community, definitely in North America, have not succeeded at doing is really giving our youth the knowledge that they require and the basic information, whether it's about geopolitics, it's about the story of the state of Israel, it's about what it means to be a Jewish person, whatever that might be, that they can come with a clarity of mind and some answers when they're going to be assaulted potentially or challenged, let's put it more mildly, on a college campus when they go off to university. I mean, is that something that is part of what this is about, is to be able to give people, like, give us an example of what type of issues does the book tackle? What type of questions are going to come up there that someone will be able to read and understand, oh, okay, now I get it.
Right. So, I'll just say to your first point about the community's sort of strategy is, as I mentioned previously, I grew up in a reform, very secular community. The community loved Israel. We loved Israel. I went to summer camp and I had all Israeli counselors, and we had Israel Day once a session. And Israel was very incorporated into my Hebrew school life, but I was never told why to like Israel. I was always just told to like Israel, without a lot of information and education as to why this place should mean something to me, besides the Holocaust, which, by the way, we can spend a whole other podcast episode talking about this, but I don't think the Holocaust is a very efficient way at this point in history of getting young Jews to care about Jewish survival today.
Right.
But again, we can have an entire different podcast about that. So the information in the book seeks to really fill in those gaps, not even fill those gaps, but really provide a foundation that is missing in the lives of a lot of young Jews, especially the ones who grew up like I did, in public schools, definitely not religious schools, definitely not Jewish schools. And so I can give examples. What does the book cover? Well, the first chapter is, who are you? And that might sound tedious. It might sound like, oh, superfluous. Jews know who they are. They know who the Jewish people are. You would be surprised. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, do not know the most basic aspects of Jewish civilization and Jewish culture, and the different denominations of Judaism, both ethnic and religious, where Jews come from around the world, the amount of Jews that are in the world. Even Jews think that they're way, way higher in number in countries all over the world. And so that's an example of a more broad chapter. But then we get into, like I mentioned before, the intricacies of the occupation and the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how the reality on the ground came to be. And part of that is mentioning and providing specific details of all of the times the Palestinians have said no to an opportunity for their own political sovereignty. We get into the weeds of the United Nations and how the different structures of the United Nations operate and how and why they've been corrupted because of the presence of anti-democratic totalitarian regimes that have infiltrated the UN. So again, important information that is not too complex, is not too complicated to share with the next generation, to teach the next generation.
And knowing you and knowing Emily, I'm guessing you're giving this out in a fun, way and not tedious, like another history
Yeah.
book assignment for the readers. By the way, just to our listeners, you'll be able to find the book. Obviously, you could just Google Blake Flayton, 10 Things Every Jew Should Know, but there's also a website, 10 Things Every Jew Should Know.com. One long word, but you'll be able to find it there as well to be able to purchase it. Blake, I mean, if I were to tell you that the state of Israel was going to be making peace with the Palestinians, that, war is now over. We finished the war in the north. The war with Gaza, hopefully with Hamas, is going to come to an end. And we're going on a track towards peace. And maybe in a year, there would be a two-state solution. Let's just say hypothetically. Would that stop the fierce anti-Israel movement within the progressive circles?
No, because they still need, as I mentioned before, they still need something to take the form of all that they see as evil. And Israel has been really helpful in that regard because it's not just for fun that you put something as the face of all that's evil. It's useful in, as I said before, coalition building and also growing a movement and strengthening a movement. You have to have something to fight against, particularly and hopefully something that's easy to picture. It's like a single entity that you need to destroy in order to achieve your political goals. And even if Israel made peace with the Palestinians, had a two-state solution, threw out the radical ministers out of its government, which, Bezrat Hashem can't come soon enough. But even with all of these steps that Israel can take, the Western hard left still needs that boogeyman, still needs that obstacle that they can show to their supporters as here's the ultimate resistance to our ideology. Here's the ultimate resistance to what we want to accomplish. It's Israel, it's the Jew. So it doesn't really matter that much what Israel does. It's sort of like how like the I was on a walk once with it was my first time in Israel, and I was on a walk with this Israeli academic, and I think you've had him on the podcast, Shani Moore, and we were walking past Rabin Square, and he said, "This is where Israelis gathered during the Second Intifada, just to sort of feel and to be with one another." And it wasn't even the fact that buses were blowing up all around us, and it was sort of playing Russian roulette to leave your house and to go to a party or a movie, but we were so sad and we were so depressed and scared because the whole world seemed to be against us. And this was the part where we were clearly the victim here. We were
Yeah.
facing a wave of terrorism. We were clearly the victim. And yet, usually when Israel is victimized, when Israel does deservedly curry world sympathy, that's simultaneously when it's most demonized. That's
Which
simultaneously when
is, which is, by the way,
most
what's been happening since October 7th, 100%, right?
exactly.
Israel, it's like Israel at its weakest point, most vulnerable point, Jewish blood spilling on the streets. It was like the heyday. It was the calling for all anti-Semites. Hey guys, let's join the party, right? And
Right.
that's unfortunately what I think we largely saw. The just one comment about what you said about the ministers who, Bezrat Hashem, please God, will be gone, not out of the government sooner rather than later. That is actually I think it's an I just want to hang on to that for a moment, because to people listening, I think what people often don't realize is that you could have somebody like yourself who is a fervent defender of Israel. But there's nuance, right? Of course, you will defend Israel when there is obscene, crazy anti-Semitism and an anti-Israel obsession. But at the same time, you know how to be critical of Israel as well.
Oh
And I think that's
yeah.
something that's lost on people. People don't get that.
Yes, I hate the discourse surrounding quote unquote criticism of Israel because usually when people say, I'm just criticizing Israel, they're not. Like David Hirsch in Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism, a great book, does really well to point out that, like, within the Labour Party in Britain specifically, a lot of times when people said, I was just criticizing Israel, you're trying to silence me, they were actually not criticizing Israel. They actually said something very problematic and anti-Semitic, and they were using that to sort of flip the conversation and actually silence the Jewish person. But that's one part of the conversation. The other part of the conversation is when criticism of Israel is actually criticism of Israel, it is necessary, more than necessary. It absolutely needs to happen all day, every day, like it has been, by the way. There's never a shortage, there's never a dearth of of criticism of Israel from people in the country and around the world. Um, but we are faced right now in Israel with, I believe, a leadership, a government more specifically, that does not have the state's best interest at heart, that has proven since their election, since they're coming into power, that they will squander any opportunity for progress and that they will always place the wrong priorities at the top of the voting list, if you will. And we have seen the consequences of that, whether it be from October 7th or before that, when it was the darkest year in Israel, even before October 7th, 2023, because of all the political upheaval. And even since October 7th, of course, we see now not enough resources going to our soldiers and our people in Miluim and people who are struggling to make a living, because the government's priorities are to enrich and continue to pour money all over the clerical institutions in this country, and also the settlement project, which I think is a direct threat to our security. So particularly in those two areas, there needs to be not just criticism, but like a more effective opposition, or rather an effective opposition, in order to get our own country together and ensure our own safety. But when it comes to the outside world, I will never buckle, and I will never give in to anybody who says that like my Zionism and my like strong belief in Israel's right to exist and right to defend itself is like problematic or not welcome. Like that is a non-starter for me, and that's why I hope to perfect my Hebrew. It's getting good, but I hope to perfect it so I could have a lot more of these conversations in Hebrew in the actual Israel space.
Well, speaking of perfecting Hebrew, you mentioned to me that you are in the process of going through with maybe drafting into the IDF.
Yes, I think I can talk about this now. I don't know why. It's a very weird process. But yes, I hope to be going in the spring of next year. I think that's an estimate that I have right now of when I'll actually be going. Um, yeah, I decided to go after October 7th because I think that really changed the reality on the ground in Israel, at least for an Oleh Hadash who arrived here thinking that the big fight was against, like I mentioned before, the government and the sinister forces that are trying to destroy Israeli democracy. And then after October 7th, it became clear, like, okay, that fight still exists, very much so, but you were silly to forget or to not know that Israel faces a much wider existential fight that requires your time and energy right now.
Well, kol hakavod, Blake, for taking that step. I mean, that's not a small one, and speaks volumes, I guess, of your dedication and commitment to Israel beyond just social media, but actually in practice, in enlisting and putting on a uniform. So we look forward to hearing good things about you and what you're going to be doing there. We'll leave that for another episode. But I want to thank you, Blake, for joining us and for being with us and sharing the story. And to everyone, once again, Blake and Emily's book, 10 Things Every Jew Should Know. You can find it on the website, 10 Things Every Jew Should Know.com, or just Google Blake Flayton book. You'll get it right there. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Yaakov.
Thanks for joining us in today's episode. As always, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, and of course, the Times of Israel's website. We'll be back here on Thursday for another episode of the